this little scene comes later on in the book when Diane is remembering how she saw Jim's speech about the very words moral courage um, when he had appeared at Marquette. Um, and so this is sort of in her memory, if you will. She always remembers how astounding it was to put the videotape in the recording machine and to watch the credits roll. There were clips on the internet, but it was difficult to find the extended recordings. Here, with the video on the large screen, they could watch it all unfurl, as if in real time, as if they were actually there. Marquette University, in the Forum. He stood at the podium. He wore a brown jacket and blue-grey shirt. His hair was slightly longer than usual. He looked at ease. He was introduced to a round of applause. "Thank you for the introduction," he said. "It was generous, overly generous." He smiled. The room hummed. "I'm not a hero. I'm not noble. I was just trying to do my work and I got in a bit of trouble." It was shortly after he had returned from Libya. After being captured for the first time, it was, he said, the biggest mistake of his life to go to the front line that day. And now he was haunted by the death of Anton. They had to leave his body behind. It was one of the things that still rattled him. He wished they could find the body. When he came home, he said, he learned just how much people had cared. It humbled him. He wanted to repay his thanks to everyone. He wasn't sure if he ever could. He had worried about his career being over. But it was proper journalism. It was important. It would live on. That's what journalism was about, the truth. If you didn't tell the truth, then what would happen to the truth? What would happen to the families behind the front line? But it wasn't worth his life, he said. No matter what romantic inclination you have, no matter what ethic you think you have, it's never worth your life. If she could have paused the tape there, she would have. What was his life worth, apart from everything? She could tell, as the tape unfurled, that there was something more behind those words. He was staring out at the camera, but he could have been looking beyond it too. He was present and elsewhere at the same time. He knew in the end that there were so many stories still to tell. He believed that the world was made of other people. He didn't want to be cliché about it, but the lure of the front line was like a siren song. He had faith, even when it was shredded sometimes. He prayed the rosary. He knew that's what his mother and grandmother would be praying. And he thought about the idea of not going back. He understood that it would be risky, but he had to do it. You know, the thing is, there's physical courage, right? He said towards the end of the tape. For some reason, I have physical courage. But really, when you think about it, that's nothing compared to moral courage. If you don't have the moral courage to challenge authority, to challenge the system, to write about things that are going to have maybe reprisals on my career, if I don't have that moral courage, we don't have journalism. And then she watches him pause a moment to study the microphone in his hand. Take it down from his lips. Let the words hang there. So, I just think we've got to make sure we have the moral courage. Thank you. Now, Diane, I think, is going to read another short section.
Do you want me to do it right now, Leah, before reflecting on the other? Okay. Okay, I've got it right here. I did a similar thing. It was, I like to think that some of the seeds of faith had been planted in his childhood, but there is no sliver of doubt in my mind that his sense of social justice was born at Marquette. His fascination with where others came from and what brought them there, where they were going, and how they might get to a better place. He was fond of a Seamus Heaney quote, "History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme." Jim's true interest was situated at that intersection. He took philosophy classes, creative writing, ethics, Spanish. He stared deep into his own country's history and came to realize what a privileged middle-class upbringing he'd had in rural New Hampshire. How lucky he'd been, the sort of comfort he'd been born into, the clapboard house, the picket fence, the intact family. He didn't want to shy away from the awareness of his own privilege. Jim was exposed to poverty and inequity in the inner cities of Milwaukee, where he was encouraged to tutor as a freshman as part of the Marquette program. I can imagine him tutoring in the classroom, tall, a little tentative, and incredibly passionate at the same time. He felt for those kids. He recognized something in their eyes. He could align himself with them. He spoke with them in fluent Spanish, but also, I'm sure, in a manner of fluent humility. One summer, he went to Appalachia to build houses with Habitat for Humanity. Another, he did service work on an Indian reservation in the Dakotas. I am well aware of a mother's tendency to oversaint her son, especially one who's taken early. But I also believe that it is not just parents who rear a child. It is the world around them. So Marquette, the teachers, his pals, the ethics of the school helped build so much of what Jim was eventually to become. I'll just leave it there.
Nicely done, Diane. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Leah, do you want to wait for
Yeah, we can wait. We can wait on the next one, I think.
and go now? Whatever you want to do.
Oh, actually, why don't you go now? I think we're all kind of enchanted a little bit by this reading, so let's keep it going. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Then the one final section that we will read is from the time when we were together in the courthouse, and you know, he has just Alexander Cote, the Beatle, the ISIS member, has just told her a story about how he had found a 1-year-old child in the rubble, and he has begun to heave with tears right in front of her. I was sitting alongside her, and it was an extraordinary moment. It will, she knows, be almost impossible to tell others, her family, her friends, about this moment. Hard to believe that the man who tortured her son is sobbing no more than 4 feet in front of her. Hard to explain that it is, most likely, not an act. Hard to illustrate how she has contained her emotions. Hard to judge if he is exploiting the moment. Even harder to explain that it is not just a story of a 1-year-old child taken from the rubble, or a father crying in a documentary, or an anonymous drone strike, or a tortured son, or a journey across mountains, or a screed of hatred, or a tower coming down, or a city filled suddenly with poison gas, or a scorched earth, or a peddling of fear, or 3 young children in front of a camera in a refugee camp, or a man who ventured out from New Hampshire, or a soldier who guided a remote drone, or a politician sitting in a suddenly small office, or a woman in East London edging her fingers along a photograph, or a 6-year-old wondering about his uncle, or a chain hanging in the air of a basement in Abu Ghraib, or a blow of a steel pipe against the bottom of a pair of feet in Rafah, or the thud of a fist in the kidneys, or a murdered messenger, or the incanted prayers, or the way it is all knitted together from Wisconsin to London to Damascus to New Hampshire to Tripoli to Virginia, all these wild and braided things somehow held together and not by language. There is no word for it that she knows of. She beseeches the Holy Spirit to come down and help her find one. Give me mercy, give me strength. Maybe it is not enough to say that it's just sad. It's all just sad. It's terribly sad. But perhaps there is no other word, just simple sadness that Jim is dead, and sadness that Alexander will spend the rest of his life in prison, and sadness that his daughter in England will never know him, and sadness that Jim's nephews will not see him at Christmas, and sadness that so many people want to poison it with narrowness, and sadness that others want to turn away and forget it all, and sadness that nobody wants to know about the hostages, and sadness that the newspapers and television stations and websites are struck dumb by indifference, and sadness that nobody knows what innocence means anymore, and sadness that we still go on about taking the lives from one another, and sadness that it comes down to either justice or revenge, as if that's the only choice, and sadness too that the very sadness itself is not an answer. She knows that she will be called naive if she tells the story somehow someday on television somewhere, or in print, or on the internet, that they will say she was duped by him, that she fell for his act, that she allowed herself to open up to his deception. But it doesn't matter, not a bit, not in this moment, no. Diane Foley allows herself for the first time, the very first time, the only time, since August the 19th, 2014, the day her son's death was announced, to cry in public. She does not make a spectacle of it. She does it quietly. Hardly anyone in the room knows. She's not even sure that Alexander, 4 feet across the table, knows. She brings a knuckle to her cheek. 7 years. No distance between then and now. I hope one day we can forgive one another, she says to Cody, and he is taken aback. There's no reason for you, he says, to offer forgiveness.